Today we are going to be talking about Civil War amputation. We will be talking about what it was like in the hospitals during the Civil War, as well as what the amputation process was like, and some modern day examples of amputation. Now, Walt Whitman, who was most famous for being a poet but was also a nurse during this time, said the real war will never get in the books, the hospital part. He's referring to the part which will never be told, all the gruesome details of what happened behind the scenes, which we will be talking about today. Now, what were hospitals like during the Civil War? Well, they weren't very pleasant. First of all, they weren't just in one location. We have what's called the MASH, or Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. These were tents that were made to go to wherever the next battle was, to excavate the wounded from the battle scenes, and to nurse them back to health, and sometimes, like we will talk about today, to involve them in immediate surgeries. We see this is the first time we have a system for taking them out of the fields, as well as nursing them back to health. Now, what would happen if a nurse came across someone after a battle? They would come and try to nurse them as much as they could back to health at that moment, but would soon have to bring them back to the MASH unit, where they would be evaluated as to whether they needed surgery or they could wait a little longer. Now, these hospitals were not great conditions. We see many would wait around, waiting for services or waiting to be helped. We see they often had to lay on cots and wait outside and mix with each other until they could be helped. Now here's an example of what a MASH unit would look like, where we see the tents in the background, where probably the most critical patients would be, and then we would see those waiting outside, maybe with less critical issues. Now, unfortunately, this all occurred a few years before the discovery of germs by Louis Pasteur, where we actually discovered that there are some scientific reasons as to why some germs pass on because of sanitation reasons. Now, for us today, that seems unheard of. But doctors, we used to dig out bullets or unwashed instruments, and they would use them over and over again. And this was not seen as wrong because germs had not yet been discovered. Now, no matter who was fighting on what side, each nurse would help both sides, whether it be the Union or the Confederacy, and they would help everyone back to the MASH unit. Now, history teaches us that the wounded and prostrated foe is not then our enemy, and that's what a medical director said, that it does not matter whether you are on the Confederate or Union side, we will help all in need. Now, what exactly is amputation? It is the removal of a body extremity by trauma or surgery. Now, we're going to be talking about more of the trauma, and that trauma is the Civil War. The Latin root actually means to cut away. Now, why would you amputate? Now, in our reasoning is this first bullet point, to prevent the spreading of infection. Many soldiers who had experienced wound or fragments had to remove a certain limb, usually their arm or leg, to keep the rest of their body healthy. Now, in some other countries, we'll see it as a form of punishment or to control an affected area, maybe even an act of terrorism, a tactic of war, or even a war injury. But mostly we see this as for the preventing of the infection. Now, what was it like? First, you were prepped for surgery in the MASH unit. You usually would be laid on a cot to hold down the patient, usually tied down if necessary. But especially the extremity in which they would amputate, they would apply a tourniquet like you see in this picture. Let's say you had to put this around the leg. You would take the tourniquet, tie it as much as possible so the blood flow would stop to that extremity. And then you would only have a limited amount of time to actually remove the limb from your body. Otherwise, you would die from the loss of blood. Now, the estimated time that you had was about 15 to 17 minutes to remove this blood. So now we're going to talk about some of the steps of what it was like to go through an amputation surgery. The first one is you would have to cut open the flesh and expose the nerves. These are some of the knives that would have been used during the Civil War time to do this. Now, these look very clean, and like we learned before, most of the time they were not that way. We do see some forms of anesthesia with alcohol, chloroform, and morphine beginning to be used during the Civil War, and that is all if they had access to it in a certain MASH. You would cut open the skin and save as much as possible in hopes of re-sewing it back together later. Now, I love this quote because it explains an often misconception about the Civil War, and it was actually from a U.S. Army surgeon. And he said, a wounded soldier, meaning someone from the Civil War, was given alcohol as a stimulant, some morphine as a painkiller, and either ether or chloroform as anesthesia. They weren't completely put to sleep. They remembered surgery but didn't feel any pain. Observers would then have seen that they were awake. They might had been the origin of the rumor that people were operated on awake without anesthesia. So we do see this rumor that many were awake, and in fact they were, but many did not feel the pain that came from those surgeries. Now the second step you would do was tie off the arteries and veins to prevent hemorrhaging. This, in fact, could be very painful, depending on the amount of morphine or ether that the patient was taking. And then the third step would be to cut open the muscles and expose the muscles. Your whole goal in getting through the veins, arteries, and muscles is to get down to the bone. And as they got through the bone, a saw would have to be used, much like we use a saw today for wood or something like that. But the movements of moving your saw had to be very distinct, and if they weren't, you could ruin the bone and possibly infect that as well. You would have to have long, bold, and regular movements. You couldn't be off pace, you couldn't be short and rapid. It was very distinct. One of the final steps was to file down the sharp and rough edges of the bone. Now, by this point, it is not very painful. The most painful parts would be in the beginning, but still resulted in some discomfort for the patient. Now, your final step was to take the skin and the muscle flaps, then put them over the stump and sew them back together like you see here. Now, this person in this picture would be considered a double amputee, where 2 limbs were actually amputated. Now, there was an optional 7th step, and this was kind of a new invention at the time, and that was prosthetics, where you had an artificial body part. We do see some peg legs and things like that, but the full motion that we see today in prosthetics had yet to be invented. Now, in some cases in the news today, we will see evidence of self-amputation if someone was stuck in a rock and needed to get out, but this is also a rarity. We do see some evidence of amputation today because of a disease called body integrity identity disorder, where a patient might not feel fully comfortable in their body and psychologically feel that they need to remove parts of their body, usually a limb, an arm, or a leg, sometimes fingers or toes, to feel more satisfied with their personal image. Now, you will have some after effects to amputation, whether medically or self-induced. There's a lot of emotional trauma and discomfort. There's a lot of practical limitations of being limited as to what you can do now because of a loss of a limb. But we also do experience these phantom limbs, which happen to about 50 to 80% of the amputees. Now, a phantom limb is when you feel a part of your body that is no longer there. Even though the body has been removed and it could go on for years, you can still feel the limb as if it can itch, ache, burn, feel tense, feel wet or dry, or other sensations. And you will often look down to your arm or leg, and even though the limb is gone, you will still feel these sensations. Your body is still aware of them. Now we see that that is kind of the end of our brief introduction into the Civil War and the amputation caused by that. And that was directed by myself, as well as some of the graphics that we received from some common help. And thank you for watching.